Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha television. You're watching a special edition of The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. Nuclear tests in May 1998, a peacemaking bus ride to Lahore in February 1999, the Kargil War a couple of months later, a transformative visit to China in June 2003, and a peace deal with Pervez Musharraf in January 2004 stand out in Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee's foreign and security policy calendar. After the nuclear test, the United States and China came together to mount unprecedented pressure on India, and it took all the guile that Mr. Vajpayee and his advisors possessed to break this nexus and repair ties with the United States. The ensuing dialogue even led to an American request for India to send its troops to Iraq, a request that was declined after much consideration in July 2003. With Pakistan, Mr. Vajpayee made two major efforts at peace, one with Nawaz Sharif and the second with Pervez Musharraf. He also responded to infiltration in Kargil and ordered a massive mobilization of Indian troops after the 2001 attack on Parliament House before agreeing to a peace deal with General Musharraf in Islamabad. Over the next half hour, we will talk about Vajpayee, the foreign policy architect. Joining me on the program now are Vivek Kharchu, former ambassador, KP Nair, strategic analyst, Abhigyan Prakash, senior journalist, and Smita Mishra, senior journalist as well. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this special telecast. Ambassador, I'd like to begin the program with you. What are the milestones in Mr. Vajpayee's foreign policy?
Mr. Vajpayee had two endeavors with foreign policy. One, if you recollect, was when he was foreign minister in the Janata government after the emergency, and the next when he was prime minister. I think in both these stints, he displayed an uncanny instinct about India's long-term national interests as well as India's strategic interests. And the one quality he displayed was that he understood when the policies needed continuity and when they needed a departure. So if you see the first period when he was foreign minister, then that was the time of the Cold War. That was still the time when India led the developing world, so to speak, and it had a view on the West Asian situation, and during that period, he conformed to the basic contours of policy as he had inherited, and also he made an endeavor of peace with Pakistan. His visit to Pakistan as the foreign minister is still remembered there. The second time when he headed the government, at that time, the world was different. The Cold War was over and India's requirements were different. And it is at that stage that he determined, first of all, that India's security and strategic interests required that India becomes overtly a nuclear power. And you mentioned the consequences of that. But during that period, after the nuclear test, I think Mr. Vajpayee and his foreign policy advisors clearly were able to convince the international community, the United States in particular, that India's size, India's standing in the international community meant that India was responsible and that India was not out to break the international system, but to claim its rightful place within that international system, and he was able to accomplish it.
Right. Mr. Nair, let me bring you into the picture now. You know, you've covered international affairs for several decades now. How would you look back at the former Prime Minister's two phases that the ambassador just spoke about?
You see, the standing, India's standing, influence, power in the post-Cold War era that we all enjoy today. In my opinion, we owe the foundations of all that to Atal Bihari Vajpayee. He he had this great sense of looking for opportunities and using them. I want to mention one or two things which are not very well known, other than the ones you discussed, which are fairly well known. You see, today we talk of our outreach to the Gulf as something for granted. We take it for granted. But it was Vajpayee who first made the outreach on the part of the BJP to the Gulf in 1997, if I recall. He was not a minister then. He was chairman of the Standing Committee on External Affairs. And I accompanied him on this trip to Oman, Kuwait. He was supposed to go to UAE, but it got cancelled. And I recall that he went to Oman and he met Sultan Qaboos, and he asked Sultan Qaboos for a plot of land for a second temple in Muscat. And Sultan Qaboos readily gave it, you know. And then he went to Kuwait, and he was to meet the speaker of the, well, I'll come to that later. In Kuwait, Kuwait did not have a Hindu crematorium. There are a large number of Indians. But if a Hindu died, he had to be brought back to India. The body had to be brought back to India for cremation. So he asked for a Hindu crematorium. And the Kuwaitis readily gave it, you know. And one aside, which is not relevant to the main thing, is he was meeting the Speaker of the Kuwait Parliament. And Kuwait has the first elected parliament in the Gulf region. So he told the speaker that there was a crisis in UP, and he told the speaker that, you know, UP assembly is taking place, so I will come and see you, but I want a TV in front of me. So they got a transponder, and the proceedings were being shown. And my God, it so happened that in the UP assembly, the MLAs had taken out the mics and they were beating each other with it, you know. Vajpayee ji was a little embarrassed, but he wanted to follow it, you know. And after the meeting, the speaker asked him, is this how democracy is conducted? Is this how parliaments and legislatures are? So Vajpayee ji never lost his sense of humor. So he told him, you know, in Lucknow the temperature gets very high, and when the temperature goes high, you know, people sometimes lose their balance, you know. And then the speaker laughed. Of course, the speaker didn't mention that in Kuwait the temperature goes up at
a few notches
50 degrees, you know.
Right.
So these were the pioneering efforts that he made, you know, which no other Indian politician did, no other Hindu politician did. Even ministers did not go to this extent of asking Sultan Qaboos for a temple land, the Kuwaitis for crematorium and all that. So he was able to pursue new opportunities.
Very
when
interesting.
The opportunities
Very interesting.
came up.
And thank you for taking us through, you know, those fond memories and fond tales as well. Abhigan Prakash, you know, what were the factors that helped in shaping the foreign policy of that Vajpayee era?
Number one point, and I'm going to take it forward from what Ambassador Katju said, he was a prime minister from whom we all always expected that he would have a definitive line to his foreign policy, for a simple reason that he'd been a foreign minister in the past, and there are still folklores, and I've traveled to Pakistan quite a lot, about Atal Bihari Vajpayee when he was the foreign minister in the Janata government. So it was clear that this particular prime minister has its own personal perspective on India's positioning. So a lot that followed was clearly in that direction, despite failed efforts, the belief in peace, simultaneously also addressing India's strategic needs. Very important, as Ambassador Katju said, post-Pokhran, being able to convince and, of course, create that international opinion that this is what India needed. We've not done it for any other reasons. It's our sovereignty and the international positioning. So what really took all this forwards was Vajpayee's personal power to convince. At the end of the day, his position and talk as a statesman took it forward. And large part, as you see, you just said in your own anchor link, till 2004, he made efforts with Musharraf. Now, see, all these things can only be done by a person who's got a strong conviction and a personal perspective on India's positioning. And that is what I personally feel, and very strongly, having seen a lot of that, helped Atal Bihari Vajpayee.
And it continues to help us even today. You know, the foundation that Mr. K.P. Nair was talking about, Smita Mishra, you know, that was laid back then, more than 15 years ago, almost 2 decades ago, the benefits of which we are reaping even today. And even today, neighborhood first continues to be one of our key policies.
Absolutely. And, you know, even though I would believe that Prime Minister Modi ji's government today is working in the same direction, of course, we have moved much further from that. The country has also moved much ahead. But I must say that the foundations, the philosophy, you know, the philosophy behind the government, that democracy must reach the last man standing in the line. If not, then democracy is a failed one, till it reaches the last person in the queue. So this present government is following the philosophy and the foundations laid down by the NDA-1 regime led by Vajpayee ji. But if we have to point out one sector or one field where we can see this impact more pronounced than any other field of governance, then I would say that is foreign policy. Because you see, diplomacy is a very subtle business, you know. You have to be, if you want to create a standing for your country, if you want the world to look up at New Delhi with an eye of respect, you have to be a courageous leader. Somebody who is a status quoist will never be able to do it. One needs a courageous person, but at the same time, you need a courageous person with a lot of finesse. You need a very subtle language. You need much that has been said, but also a lot that is left unsaid, which is to be understood. And I think whatever gains we are seeing in the international arena today for our country, for New Delhi, for our government and our people, I think the beginning was made in those 6 years of Atal Bihari Vajpayee regime. And it will be a sad day for people like us who have covered that chapter of India's politics, and for the youngsters today who want to understand the subtleties of foreign policy. If we were to limit Vajpayee ji's courage and his initiatives and his understanding to his policy with Pakistan, I think that would be extremely unfair to him and his the milestones that he set, you know. Right. Because he displayed courage and initiative and a depth of understanding in our relations with the entire world, right, and the neighborhood to begin with. I think the first decision taken by the Narendra Modi government to forget the past and invite all SAARC leaders to join him in his oath-taking ceremony was the first step of carrying forward that Vajpayee legacy, because Atal Bihari Vajpayee never gave up his peace initiative despite having very bitter experiences. Any other leader in his place wouldn't have dared to, you know, make one more peace initiative after what we went through in Kargil, right, and the parliament attack. Right, but he did.
Just make quick point here. When we traveled with him, and I remember one of my first trips with him for a summit to the European Union, must remember by the foreign press also, because he was the first BJP politician, as he mentioned, I've said this repeatedly earlier, that he was Atal Bihari Vajpayee even before he became the Prime Minister of India. So he was known, he was recognized and referred as former Foreign Minister of India, now the Prime Minister of India, by the press and the international media then. This made a huge difference. So his presence was not something that Atal Bihari Vajpayee needed to fight for or seek attention.
Right. You know,
it's not a small thing that a prime minister from a different party, and he being an opposition leader, is asked to go and represent the country in an international forum.
Indeed. Indeed. Ambassador, I'm going to go back to a point that several of the, speakers made talking about how several attempts were made to try and, bridge the gap, try and work out some kind of a solution as far as the Pakistan problem was concerned. Despite several failed attempts, he continued to persuade, he continued, to try and deal with that particular problem. What was the driving force, really?
Before I come to that, may I say a quick word? KP was right when he said about Mr. Vajpayee's initiatives in the Gulf in the 90s, but I recollect that his first visit to Abu Dhabi, for instance, took place in 1979 when he was the foreign minister. And I can tell you, because I was there then as a very young officer, he made a tremendous impact on the Gulf leadership at that stage. But to come back to Pakistan, I think Mr. Vajpayee was convinced that that the neighborhood required peace, and that is why he made this endeavor in 1999. But there was one other factor, which was that after the nuclear tests, we had to. India had to display that India was in actual fact a very responsible emerging power, a power which had a rightful aspiration to global status, and for that purpose it was imperative to take to show the world that it was making very serious endeavors to take the neighborhood along with itself, including those neighbors with which it had adversarial relations. And therefore, there was this outreach to Pakistan. So it was both, it stemmed from a conviction that the neighborhood needed to be knit together and taken along, and also because of the imperatives of diplomacy at that stage. That it failed because of, at that stage, because of Kargil is obvious. But he didn't allow that to embitter him. There's one other thing that we need to take into account, which is that after 9/11, the world had also changed with regard to terrorism. So there was a sobering in Pakistan too. And then when Prime Minister Vajpayee continued with his initiative, Musharraf responded to some degree. But as we know, his commitments on the fact that Pakistan will not use its territory to carry on terrorism did not hold. And
Right.
Pakistan continues with its cross-border terrorism even today. One last thing, very quickly.
Yeah.
I think you should see how he handled China, and you mentioned China. In 1998, if you recollect, the Chinese were very irked because one of the reasons which he spelled out in his letter to President Clinton was that we had had a war with China, and China was very upset. But it was the same China with which in 2003 he had a path-breaking visit, and today the Chinese came out paying tribute to Mr. Vajpayee and recalling his contributions to bilateral relations. So that itself is a tribute to his diplomacy.
Indeed. Mr. Nair, I want to draw your attention to the whole, India-US ties at that point in time. After Pokhran II, the wrath of the United States descended upon us. There were sanctions that followed. Several countries, were not happy with what happened as far as the nuclear test was concerned. But within a span of 2 years, all that changed. We saw the then president of the United States, even make a state visit to India, Bill Clinton, and those were some of the visuals that
After 22 years.
Yeah, after 22 years. And those were some of the visuals that we played out as well. What changed really?
Well, before I answer your question, very briefly, I want to thank Vivek for recalling the visit to Abu Dhabi. I had the great pleasure of working with Vivek in the UAE at that time. He is a diplomat and I was living there as a correspondent. So yes, it was a great outreach. But to come back to your question, you see, what changed fundamentally the relationship with the US after the nuclear tests were two things. One is that unlike every other prime minister we've had since independence, Vajpayee was the most likable Indian prime minister abroad, you know. Indira Gandhi was formidable, but she was intensely disliked in Washington, you know, from the Kissinger tapes and what Nixon said and all that. Jawaharlal Nehru was seen as, the Americans saw him as an upstart. He was a great leader, of course, but they saw him as an upstart, you know. Vajpayee did not compromise on Indian interests in any way, but nobody could dislike him, you know. So he was the most likable Indian prime minister that the Americans ever came across. That's one. Number two, he was able to assemble a team which could cut both ways. On the one hand, there was Jaswant Singh, who had this stentorian voice, and when Jaswant Singh appeared on American television, the anchors often had to reach for the dictionary to find out the meaning of what he was saying. And then there was Brajesh Mishra, the national security advisor, who would mince no words, you know. I mean, Brajesh Mishra could cut any American negotiating with him into half. So Vajpayee's great asset was there was this nice man.
Picking the right men for the right job as well.
Nice man, very likable man in the middle. And on the one side, he had this man who was a tough negotiator. On the other side, he was the other man who was like an intellectual. So assembling this very efficient team which knew what it wanted to get for India is actually what turned the Indo-US relationship to our advantage after the nuclear test.
Okay, I've got limited time on the program, so I'm going to ask you to be brief going forward. 4 minutes left. Abhigyan Prakash, let's go back to a point that the ambassador was making about China. Of course, the relationship started on a very sour note, but it ended on a high. There was progress made with China as well, especially on Sikkim.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, the visit was very historic. The other point is very important to say today, and on this day particularly, whatever efforts he made with Pakistan, and as and when they failed, the sympathy and support for Atal Bihari Vajpayee grew. You have to understand the difference. So there was enough conviction on the other side, and as everyone points out, he had the right people for the right job, that this man was right, others were wrong. So never. Today we are discussing that. We are doing a program in foreign policy only because of that. Similarly, in the case of China, as Ambassador Kaju said, he made a historic visit. Everything was basically his personal popularity. A, likable, you know, very affable human being that he naturally was, and B, his own convincing powers. So
right.
That made all the difference. And I can never forget that in the case of Pakistan, there was so much of support and sympathy for him, and no Pakistan leader then and in those circumstances could convince the international community in any other way. That was his power, Vajpayee's.
Smita Mishra, is it safe to say then that, you know, any examination of India's foreign policy will be incomplete without looking at the contribution of Shri Atal Bihari Vajpayee?
Yes, completely. He was a complete charmer, you know, he was a complete charmer. And his charming personality came into use in no other field more than it did in the field of international relations, you know. I think not just to say that in India's foreign policy, it is a very important stopover, those 6 years of Mr. Vajpayee, if we leave out the 13 days, but I must say that it is almost like a milestone, you know, from where we know that, yes, this is that point from which we move ahead. Whether you look at Pakistan, whether you look at China, whether you look at the paradigm shift in our relations with the Western countries, whether we look at India's courage to stand up for its strategic interests in Pokhran. I am sorry, in this brief show, we could not dwell much on Pokhran. How can you forget Pokhran?
Right.
That is where our present status begins, you know. So I think it will be not just an important chapter. Mr. Vajpayee's regime in terms of foreign policy is now like a reference point for all future regimes.
Right. Mr. Nayak, closing comment from you on what would you see as the biggest achievement of Atal Bihari Vajpayee as far as foreign policy is concerned?
In my opinion, to recall his biggest achievement, I will have to draw on a private conversation with him, which I have never mentioned before. The Iraq war was beginning, and I felt so strongly about Iraq that I came down from Washington, where I was posted then, and I had a conversation with Vajpayee, and I told him, Atalji, you should not send troops to Iraq. You know, I felt very strongly about it. And of course, we were talking not as a journalist and Prime Minister, it was a very private conversation. And then he told me, "Maine faisla kiya hai, I will not send troops," you know. This was before anybody knew. So, you know, the man was clear cut. He knew what he was going to do. Yet, he allowed a full-fledged discussion, intergovernmental discussion within the government on the options and all that, because he wanted to know the options.
Whether he was taking the right decision or
and
not.
you know, if we had sent troops to Iraq at that time, I think we would have been in an absolute mess with ISIS and
With everything that has
Al-Qaeda
followed.
and everything. You know, Vajpayee saved us, I think, from this fate
Right.
by not sending the troops to
Right.
Iraq.
Ambassador, I'm going to let you have the last word on the program.
His contributions to the making of India as we are going ahead have been immeasurable. It's not only in foreign policy. In foreign policy, I agree with my colleague who said that it will be a reference point.
All right. On that note then, we'll call it a wrap on this edition, on this special telecast, of course. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and sharing your views with me. Our coverage, of course, on remembering Atal Bihari Vajpayee will continue on the other side. Stay tuned. We'll be back after this short break.